So in the second tutorial of this series, we're going to take on the wind event where we left off, and I'm going to incorporate some more realistic features using FMOD sidechaining system. To do this, we're going to go back and edit some aspects of the main wind track. This is going to end up being the main controller for the other aspects of wind. And basically, the problem with our previous model is it's based on random LFOs. So we can have a random wind, a random howling, but the point is they'll all be random, so there'll be moments when perhaps the howling wind is really going for it, high frequency, high amplitude, but the buffeting effect is not there. Or of course, vice versa, we can have a buffeting low frequency effect and no corresponding howling wind because the LFOs just happen to randomly be doing opposite things. Now this isn't very realistic. So basically speaking, wind changes in velocity only, and the change in velocity, of course, increases the perceived loudness of that wind and the frequency of any resonance in the howling aspect of the wind that might be going on. So what I want to do with this is to work backwards a little bit, and we're going to have a look again at the amplitude modulation. So I'm going to push this up to 20 dBs of modulation. So what we can do, instead of running everything by random LFOs, what we can do is measure the loudness of this signal using a sidechain. So I'm going to create a sidechain here, make sure the sidechain is after the volume modulation that we're going to be doing. What we're going to do is use the sidechain, which is measuring the loudness of this LFO, and we're going to use this to drive the cutoff frequency of this filter modulation. To do so, we need to make sure, of course, that the filter is now post the sidechain. So rather than randomly modulate this, let's remove all modulation, we can instead add modulation by sidechain. The input will be the only sidechain we have, which is the sidechain on main. I'm going to go for maximum modulation to begin with until we can hear what's going on. I'm going to be monitoring the amplitude that we can see in this meter. In order to get the full range, it's going to be a lot easier if I work with a periodic waveform. In this case, square, so we get the two extremes. So what we can see there is that this signal's loudness is modulating between -10 and -30 with a 20 dB depth. I think it's actually working at about -11 to -31. I'm just going to boost it by 1 dB as a result. So over here I want to match that range in our threshold. So down to -30, -10. And I'm going to put this back to a sine waveform so that we can hear the sort of slopes between the two extremes. So you get the idea here. What we have now is a control signal that is going to create random changes to the, let's say, velocity of my wind, and we're going to use that control signal to drive the various filters. If we have a look at the howling wind now, I'm going to decrease the depth of the LFO as it stands, and I'm going to temporarily get rid of the panning as well, for reasons we'll see in a minute. So I'm going to add modulation to the center frequency of our bandpass filter, this time to the sidechain. Same settings as before, -10 to -30. So right now the main wind is a bit louder than the howling wind. Of course, if I change this volume, I'm changing the sidechain as well. So this time I want to boost the howling wind, maybe lower the master a bit. But what we can do here is bring back a little bit of that random LFO that we had on the howling filter. Well, what that means is that the pitch of this filter will be relative to the loudness of the previous signal, but that when it goes up in pitch, it won't always be linear, it won't always be the same sort of pitch. So let's add back that sort of randomness. And let's turn our control signal, now that we have everything set up, let's turn this back to a random waveform. So that's working quite nicely. However, our howling wind is now equal in volume, regardless of the amplitude or frequency. Now here's a funny thing in FMOD. If I was to sidechain the volume of this track, and if we were to run this from the made sidechain, usual sort of thresholds, then what you can hear there is that as the pitch of this howling sample goes up, the loudness goes down. Now what this means is that this dB amount in sidechaining of volume is actually a negative amount. What we need to be able to do is control positive and negative, which means I can't do this with the track fader. So we'll remove the modulation from here. Instead, I can do this using a band of the EQ. So if instead we go and get, for instance, a low shelf, put this low shelf very high, then we can modulate the volume or amplitude of this signal inside the EQ. Because this is a low shelf, we of course have positive and negative gain. So if I sidechain this gain, similar settings as before, so I'm going to go for a quite high percentage and maybe lower the total volume of the signal here. So I believe that's working quite nicely there. So how can we make this even more interesting or more realistic? I want to add a low frequency element that is going to be the sonic representation of diaphragm buffeting. So basically when you stand on a hilltop and there is strong wind, obviously every now and then the wind going into your ear canal essentially distorts. The equivalent in a microphone is very obvious if you're not using a proper windshield. So we want to create that sort of interest there. I'm going to add a new track. I'm going to copy and paste my container as before. I'm just going to call this low. And we're going to put quite a different filter on this. I'm going to go for a more extreme 24 dB per octave filter, still a low Q value. I'm interested in what's going on below 300 Hertz in this signal. To hear these frequencies properly, I need to be able to boost them with the low shelf. I'm going to match the cutoff frequency to my previous filter. So I'm going to go for a quite high percentage and maybe lower the total volume of the signal here. So if instead we go and get, for instance, a low shelf, put this low shelf very high, then we can modulate the volume or amplitude of this signal inside the EQ. Because this is a low shelf, we of course have positive and negative gain. So if I sidechain this gain, similar settings as before, And it's really that low frequency element there that I'm interested in. Because I'm boosting a low shelf below 300 Hertz by a large degree, and because, of course, noise definitely has amplitude down at 20 Hertz, whether we can hear it or not, I'm also going to put an insurance high-pass filter on this. Maybe I'm being overcautious. This low frequency aspect here, I want this to be controlled, of course, by the same signal. This time I'm going to control the gain of the low shelf. Same input, same sort of dynamic range. And of course we won't hear the modulation if we are in solo. So I'm going to solo the main signal and I'm going to ignore the howling just for the moment. And with it, I'm also going to come and modulate the frequency as well. So I'm going to lower this down to about 100 Hertz, increase it by quite a large percentage. That sounded quite nice there. Let's hear all three of them together. So I'm quite happy with that in general. Now to go from mono to stereo, previously I put an LFO on the pan pot. And what this does is literally moves the wind around from left to right, which is not really how we experience wind. We can't localize wind as moving around. So what I'm going to do instead of that is to mimic the idea of having two ears. The main and low tracks will leave for the moment, but the howling wind here, what I can do is copy the whole track, paste the whole track. Now we have a replica, pan one to the left and one to the right. Now, of course, at the moment, they are being fed by the same control signal. So if we pan one to the left and one to the right, other than this little bit of modulation here, 12.5%, they will be essentially doing the same thing. There are a couple of ways we could overcome that. I could, first of all, come along and change some of the settings, change some of the amounts, change some of the rates, and so on, which we'll just do straight away. But these changes will be pretty minor. So what's happened is in copying and pasting the track, the sidechain inputs have been lost. So I just need to reconnect those. And we can repeat this stereo process for the low frequency wind effect. So I also want to limit the panning effect a little bit. I'm going to bring it back down to 50% between the two different signals. So there we go. I hope you'll agree that we have pretty convincing changes in wind velocity represented in both pitch and loudness there. And again, all working from one single white noise sample. In the next section of this tutorial, we'll look at making this asset interactive using a windiness parameter.